Ben, last time on the podcast, we addressed the rise of online church and even online church membership.
That's right.
We said it's clear that such a thing is not consistent with New Testament church life. Mm-hmm. We need to be gathering in person to be faithful to the Lord. Well, that leads us to the next logical question, which is, how often should we attend church worship services? Mm-hmm. And are we being too casual in our day and age about church attendance?
That's right. It also brings up the partner question to that. The other side of that is, are some people legalistic about church attendance? Many of us grew up, we were in church 3 times a week. If the doors were open, we were there. We've all used that phrase. And so given the trend today, there are many people that think, I'll go once a quarter to church. I'll go once a month to church. And somewhere between that and feeling like I need to be there, I must be there whenever the doors are open, or maybe I'm not a Christian, we need to ask, how often should we be in church? That's a valid question. And so I want to talk very briefly about this, then we'll answer some practical questions. But I want to talk biblically, theologically, and historically. Biblically, I'd start in Hebrews 10:24 and 25. Listen carefully to this. Let us consider how to stir one another to love and good works, to stir up one another to love and good works. Well, how do you do that? Not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another all the more as you see the day drawing near. So infrequent church participation was a problem in the early church too. And the writer of Hebrews calls it out. Yeah. And the reason he calls it out is he's saying you will not be effective at encouraging others in your church family if you only see them occasionally. Right. If you only see them once a month, you will never develop a deep and meaningful relationship with them that will allow them to speak into your life and you to consider how to speak into their life so you can stir one another up to love and good works. We need to be honest about that. And if you feel like these days are getting stranger, this verse says, and all the more as you see the day, capital D, the day of judgment, the day of the Lord's return, of salvation drawing near.
Increase, don't decrease in that, right?
Precisely. Yeah. This would seem a particularly strange time to distance yourself from engagement with the local church. But furthermore, Acts 2:42 and then 2:46 says, and they, the Christians in the early church, devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. 46 says, and day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts. Now, without getting too specific, the pattern seems quite clear that Christians were gathering very regularly for worship, for teaching, for encouragement, for prayer. This was not an occasional thing. They were, as you had pointed out earlier when we spoke, they devoted themselves to this kind of gathered worship and encouragement and relationships. But, theologically, that's part of a bigger picture. And I want to just read through a handful of verses. In the Old Testament, we see that God created a 7-day cycle for humans to live in. Right? Genesis 2 and 3, on the 7th day, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. Exodus 2:8. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall not labor. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. Sabbath is very important in the Old Testament law. God took it seriously. There was discipline for not obeying the Sabbath even in Israel. Now in the New Testament, we're not under the law in the same way, but the law still instructs us. In the New Testament, we see that God's new covenant people continue dedicating one day to the Lord. It was just a different day in a different way. Yeah. That day shifted to the first day of the week, to Sunday, in honor of the day that Jesus rose, but it was still used as a day of worship. Yeah. And so Acts 20, verse 7, on the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread, Paul talked with them. Here are Christians gathering on that day. You say, but how do you know that was every day? Maybe that just happened to be a first day of the week. Well, 1 Corinthians 16, Paul's writing to the church in Corinth, giving them instructions for worship when they gather. He says this, 1 Corinthians 16:2, on the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up as he may prosper, so there will be no collecting when I come. He's telling them how to set money aside for the poor in Jerusalem in response to the famine there. And Paul is assuming, he's just speaking to the regular pattern of Christians in Corinth in the first century, which was that they gathered every week on the first day of the week. And he says, as part of your gathered worship, take up this collection for the poor. Revelation 1:10, later, this is John on the island of Patmos. He says, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice. So by that time, Sunday is being referred to as the Lord's Day. It's a day that's set aside to the Lord for gathering and worshiping the Lord in relationship with other people. So the pattern is pretty consistent, both biblically by way of clear statements, theologically by way of this picture of a weekly cycle with a day dedicated to the Lord. That something like weekly worship is the norm, and historically, I'll just say briefly, for 2,000 years, there's a consistent pattern of the faithful gathering for worship and doing it weekly. Right. This has been a consistent pattern throughout church history. It is a very new and unique and modern problem that many in our day are deciding that maybe monthly, maybe once every other month, maybe once a quarter, maybe I'll just do this whole thing online. This is very new and historically unique. And look at the state of America.
Wow.
We'd be a little unwise to not make some sort of a connection there, I think. Yeah. So that leads to some practical questions, though, doesn't it?
Because the case that you've made from Scripture and theology, I think is very clear. But you did mention the question of legalism. And so when we were talking earlier, you used a great illustration, I think, that would help us to understand any claim that we are being legalistic by suggesting that people gather weekly for worship.
Yeah, you know, in answer to that, I could only call that necessarily legalistic if I would also say that it's legalistic for me to desire more time with my wife. We just spent an evening together, and it's been busy. We haven't had as much time as I'd like together lately, and it was wonderful. Yeah. And I said, we've got to do this more often, right? Because I love her, and I want more time with her, and that's not legalistic. I hope that no one's going to accuse me of a legalistic approach to marriage because I desire intentional time with my wife. So really the question is one of the heart. Yeah. If anyone is saying, I must be in church a certain number of times a month or a week in order to be saved, that would be rank legalism that we would want to reject in the strongest possible terms. But if someone finds gathering for worship a real chore and something that they find themselves consistently avoiding and kicking against, I would want them to be real honest and look into their heart and say, why? Why do you find gathering with the people that Jesus came to die for and love so much? Why is that such a chore? I've never found that to be a chore. So I think that's an area for honest inquiry for a person.
Ask about their motivations, right? To ask the Lord to search them and reveal perhaps any sinful motivations they need to confess to the Lord and repent of. Yeah. Well, there also might be someone who has kind of a thwarted conscience as they think about church attendance. It might be for reasons where they can't make it to church as often as they'd like to. So when can a person miss church, and how would you answer questions that a person with a thwarted conscience might ask about these things?
Yeah, that's good because, for instance, we have firemen in the church. We have policemen in the church, doctors, nurses. These are people, they don't get to pick their schedule. They have to work some weekends. And I'm glad that they do because then when I get rushed to the hospital, there they are,
Yes.
you see. However, this is a question of the heart. And I've been blessed to see folks in all of these professions who are required to work some weekends. First of all, they long to be with the body. Yeah. They express that they miss when they're not here, and they gather with the body as often as they can. And some there are who have told me, depending on my schedule, if it's 24 on, 48 off, for instance, that they'll come to church on Sunday and then choose a home group on a day of the week that allows them to be there even if they miss church on Sunday. You see, this is a question of the heart. Yes. This is not a question of performance. And so for some, that's an issue. And that's obviously very, very understandable in our 24/7 type society. Things just don't shut down anymore on Sunday. But at the same time, there's some who do have control over their schedule and over their job. And I've also known people who have quit jobs or turned down jobs because they were told, no, we will need you to work every Sunday. Yeah. And they've trusted the Lord and said, no, I can't do that. I simply cannot dismiss myself long term from gathering with the body. And so they trust the Lord and look elsewhere. Sometimes that has also been the case. Some people are ill. If you have active flu, we would encourage you to stay home, right? And that's where modern technology is nice, and we do stream the service, and that's a great time when you're home with a fever to stream the service. That would be an act of kindness. That would be a way to consider how to stir one another up to love and good works. But that's occasional, right? And so all that to say, there are obviously times when one cannot be in fellowship. But my hope would be that person, if their heart is in the right place and they're walking closely with the Lord, they're going to long to be back in fellowship as they can, when they can. Yeah. Did you have other questions?
I think that's about it. I think that we need to have a mentality that says we get to worship with God's people. We don't have to, we get to. It's a matter of the heart, like you said. Yeah.
That's good. And so, it's just interesting, the culture we're in right now, that to bring up this topic, I already know there's people watching with furrowed brows and saying, are you really going to dare to speak to how often someone should be in church? But I think it's a great question.
And a matter of priority, too, right?
That's right. Yeah. This is something in wisdom and maturity that I think needs to be discussed. And so call us, email us. If you think that we have overstepped here, we've not been faithful with the scriptures, great. That's a good opportunity for discussion. And send us some other questions that you have.
Thank you.